And so, ladies and gentlemen, after a really hard fought and dirty political campaign, we now have old Hickory as our president. Now, one thing I would like you to keep in mind, both sides played dirty in the previous election. However, look at all the various things said by the Jackson camp against Adams. For the most part, those things were either flat out lies or at the very least misleading. Whereas all those things said by the Adams camp against Jackson, those were all pretty much true. Jackson is going to come in as a very, very new type of president. He's going to come in as a man of the West. Now, while John Quincy Adams wasn't exactly a part of the founding generation, his father was, so he's more closely tied with that generation. Jackson is going to be brand new. He's going to come in from the West. He's going to have a power base that is very, very different from any previous president, and as such, he's going to have a very different leadership style and different presidential style than any who had come before him, and it's just going to be a very different world once Jackson is inaugurated as president. So when we're talking about Andrew Jackson, when we're talking about old Hickory, what kind of individual was he? Now, he was, you could argue, a child of the Revolution. He was, in his early teens when this was going on. He ends up having a scar on his hand, as the story goes, because he refused, as a prisoner, to shine the shoes of a British officer. Now, Andrew Jackson, when he became president, had already battled against things such as dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, and lead poisoning. Now, the reason he had lead poisoning is the man was willing to duel, and he still had in his body 2 bullets from previous duels he had fought. And in his case, in these 2 duels, it was either a lot better, smarter, safer, whatever word you want to use, or they just didn't have the ability to remove the bullets. So he comes into office having survived quite a bit. And he's going to continue to have the same attitude toward life that he did beforehand. He personified this new West that the United States was growing. He would be referred to as a jack of all trades, a person who could do a little bit of everything. He was rough. He was a fighter. He was genuinely a folk hero. Remember, he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He was the man who was in command and stitched together regulars and pirates and militia and freed slaves and all sorts of different individuals to fight off the British. So he's going to personify what we see as that rugged individualism of the West, that he's an individual who's going to stand for his beliefs. He's going to fight for those beliefs as, is necessary, and he's going to really leave a mark not just on the presidency itself, but on the entirety of the American character. Andrew Jackson is still on our $20 bill. He did not like the idea of a national currency like that. He didn't like the idea of a national bank, and we'll talk about his fight against the Bank of the U.S. coming up. But I have maintained before there has long been talk of replacing Jackson on the 20. My personal hope is that they leave him on there. He was not one of my more favorite presidents, so I always make the argument that if they leave him on the 20, something he would have absolutely hated, he'll be spinning in his grave for all eternity. He was actually born in, quote-unquote, the Carolinas. Problem is, we don't know which one. North Carolina, South Carolina, one of those, but we're not exactly sure. And both states will still claim to be his home. He had been orphaned early on. He had an interest in cockfighting, having, roosters actually fighting to the death. And he started that interest as a kid. Now, I know in today's world, that is something that is greatly looked down upon as an abhorrent, quote unquote sport. But at the time, it was just something fairly common. So he was into these sort of very, rough sports and rough entertainments. He was not an individual of letters. He was not really good in regards to reading and writing. He would go through and on letters and things like that, he sometimes would misspell the same word in a totally different way, perhaps, in the same letter. So we're not looking at a president who is coming into the office as somebody who is greatly polished, someone who has gone through all the various concepts of school, going on to, college and stuff like that, and being trained in the varieties of, diplomacy and interpersonal relationships and stuff like that. But we're just going to get a very rough and tumble Westerner that's going to leave a mark on the White House in, more ways than one. The only requirements to be president of the United States are you have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen, you have to be 35 years old, and you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. Outside of that, there is no requirement that you go to college. There's no requirement that you've been involved in government before, nothing like that. And if you want someone who did meet the requirements but didn't meet the expectations, then Andrew Jackson is going to be the president you want to watch. Now, while Jackson had been born in the Carolinas, he really got his start in Tennessee. Now, he moves to Tennessee. There is, in a great number of Americans after the Revolution and in the early 1800s, there is that desire to go west. Some of that comes from just the want of land. Some of it is just the desire to start afresh. Some of it is to just see it as the best way they can, get forward, get ahead in the world. So he's going to go to Tennessee. There he becomes a judge and a congressman. Now, keep in mind that today we have various requirements or desires for judges and congressmen and things like that. Again, the Constitution, all that is required to be a member of the House of Representatives is you have to have been a U.S. citizen for 7 years, you've got to be 25 years old, and you got to live in the state from which you're representing, that particular district. Same kind of thing with a law degree at that point in time. There was not really a law school or a law degree. You got some law books, you read and studied them, then you hung out a shingle saying that you are now a lawyer, and if you were good at your job, people kept coming back. If not, you closed up shop. And then eventually that could get you, if you'd been a lawyer for a while, that could get you elected to being a judge. So he was both a judge and a congressman. And he found that his passions could really be worked up on a variety of different issues. He was very passionate about various subjects to the point that when speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives, for example, he could really get choked up. Now, you don't really stop and think about that kind of image of Jackson with the other image of, the two bullets still lodged in him. But at the same time, it just sort of shows the duality that he had. On matters of great importance to him, he would really get worked up when speaking about them. He was, however, even though he would get choked up about these things, he was also a man with a very violent temper. He got into a number of duels. We just mentioned that. 2 bullets were still within him. I honestly don't know how many duels he fought, how many he won, how many he lost, etc. But, if you still have the 2 bullets in you, it's a pretty good sign you fought quite a few duels. He was a barroom brawler. He just enjoyed fighting. He was involved with, stabbings. I mean, you name it. This guy had a background with a great deal of violence in it. I did hear one historian describe him as the type of a man who would fight at the drop of a hat, and he'd be the one to drop the hat. But while he does have all of this sort of rough and tumble aspect about him, he was what would be known as a Western aristocrat. Okay, he was a slave owner and he owned quite a few slaves. He lived in a fine mansion. It was called the Hermitage, or the Hermitage. There you have a drawing of it about that time frame. Okay, he did also at this point in time share a great number of prejudices that were the same as the mass of the American people. He was an Indian fighter, for example, who had a great deal of respect for the Indians in regards to their fighting abilities and their fighting prowess, but at the same time did not feel that they had any inherent rights. So you can again see that he was a product of his time. He was a product of where he was living, the time in which he was living, and what he was exposed to. And as a result, you're going to have a very tumultuous life and therefore an even more tumultuous presidency. All of these different aspects of life, good, bad, and ugly, have gone through to define the man that he was when he came into office. The good, the bad, and the ugly were all going to show up at different points during Jackson's administration. You may or may not have noticed that I have continuously referred to President Jackson oftentimes as Old Hickory. If you hadn't noticed that I had been saying that, you might have noticed that that was the title of this particular little section of slides. So there's a reason he was referred to as Old Hickory. Now, he really got this name because of his troops. They referred to him as Old Hickory because they saw him as tough. In fact, when he became president, he asked not to be called Mr. President, but instead wanted to be referred to still as General. He enjoyed the military. He enjoyed when he was, a general, and kept going. His nickname came as a direct result of all that. Now, he was also an anti-federalist. Okay, he believed that the federal government, as it existed at that moment, was really for the privileged, and for the privileged alone. Now, he did maintain that the Union itself, the Union of States, was sacred, that there was nothing, there was no reason, there was no political argument, nothing that would be allowed to break up that Union. And he did believe that the Union had that federal power over the states. Still in all, he welcomed the Western concept of democracy. Democracy is ruled by the people, and I've said it before, we are not a democracy, we are a republic. But Jackson was going to go through and he was going to work very hard to increase the democracy aspect of our republic. He did want more people involved. He did want more people able to vote. Now, he did not want every single person to be able to vote, but he did expand the voting rolls. He did go through and worked very hard on trying to increase the overall number of voters. We spoke about this previously, that we're talking about universal white male suffrage. And generally speaking, during his time, that would be really accomplished. Now, again, the idea of a democracy is everybody would vote on every single issue. We tend to think of democracy more of what happens in the United States, that we go out and we vote for our representatives to go make the laws on our behalf. It is a system that has worked, but you have to also keep in mind that we can look back to the 1800s with that benefit of 20/20 hindsight I've mentioned before. This was still a point in time when the United States was very new and very fresh on the scene. As such, you were still mixing together all the various aspects of the nation, be those regional, be those political, however you want to look at it, and we were still milling those together to arrive at the system of the nation that you and I enjoy to this very day. But back then, it was still very new, and as the nation was progressing west, those feelings of democracy, of wanting everybody to vote, of wanting a say in government, were definitely on the rise. there were those then and now who do look at Washington, D.C. as a group of elitists who know better than the common man what is best for them. And there will always be that tension between those two camps. It is something that we have been dealing with since the foundation of our country, and I am fairly confident we will still be dealing with that for generations to come. And all this, ladies and gentlemen, really brings us to how did Old Hickory, how did President Jackson command once he became president? Well, in all honesty, he commanded through both fear and respect from his subordinates. There are a number of stories about Jackson's temper that I've mentioned before, that the man had a temper, but he also used the story of his temper to get his way. There are stories about him having cabinet meetings and different meetings and whatnot, where he would pound his fists on the table and he would yell and scream at people, and they would hustle out of the room to try and get it done because of the president's temper. And once they were gone, he'd turn to someone who was there and kind of grin and say, "They thought I was mad." And so he would use that fear and respect in order to get things done. Now, another aspect of his presidency was that on numerous occasions he ignored the Supreme Court totally. One of the best examples on this would be the Indian Removal Act that led to the Trail of Tears that we'll talk about here shortly. In that case, the Cherokee Nation had actually sued the federal government in court. They made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice, John Marshall at the time, they ruled that the Cherokee were in the right, that they could not be forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. Andrew Jackson is reported to have said that Mr. Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it, and went ahead and removed the Cherokee anyway. It is one of those things that the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, really only functions as long as it has the support of the executive branch. And we'll see later on when we get to talking about integration and the civil rights movement in the 50s, when we have Brown versus Board of Education and the schools are to be integrated, you'll see how, while here Jackson blew off the Supreme Court, you'll see President Eisenhower at that point support the Supreme Court through force of arms if necessary. So you can see that he is his own person. He's going to go about ruling the way he wants to. And for good or for ill, that's going to be one of the true hallmarks of his presidency. Another thing is the veto power. If Congress, both the House and the Senate, pass a bill, it goes to the president's desk. If the president signs it, it becomes a law. If the president vetoes it, basically he's saying no, and he's returning it to Congress with his objections. Now, Andrew Jackson is the 7th president of the United States, and he used his veto power 12 times. If you put together all the presidents before him, from Washington through John Quincy Adams, there had only been 10 vetoes out of all 6 of those. So he really was leaving his mark here. When he had his inauguration, he actually just let whomever wanted to come into the White House. And this was going to have some very negative effects. The stories are that as they came in, tracking mud and things like that, breaking windows, they wrecked the china that was there. They caused chaos, and it was a major, major problem. Now, the only way they finally got them out of the White House was that they were told that there was spiked punch on the White House front lawn. Now, I've also heard it referred to that not as spiked punch, but that there was free whiskey out on the front lawn. But they went out to get that spiked punch, and that was going to be the first inaugural bowl. So Jackson, while all this is going on, while you do have these people trampling through the White House, breaking things, causing all sorts of grief and stuff like that, he snuck out a back door, went to a hotel, and had a steak dinner. So while the people were there enjoying the White House, Jackson wasn't even there. The conservatives at the time condemned Jackson as King Mob. and they berated him greatly for this. They went after him, questioning, what kind of individual have we put into office? What kind of president are you if you're just going to let the mob walk through and trample things within the White House? So there was a great deal of concern. Going back, I've mentioned before, to the framers of the Constitution, there was a great deal of concern over what would be called a mobocracy. And there were a number of people were quite fearful that with Andrew Jackson now in power, now being president of the United States, that not only did we have a mobocracy, but the mob had a king, and that king would be none other than President Andrew Jackson.